Okay guys, so in this presentation we're going over how do we warm up for peak performance, and we're going over what the science says. So the first part of the warm up is that we want to increase tissue temperature. This is probably where the name warm up comes from, because this is the most general and probably the first thing and probably the most important thing we need to do. There's not much direct research on the influence of tissue temperature on performance, but it's pretty common knowledge, and it's pretty anecdotally sound that increased sort of general warm-up and tissue temperature is necessary for performance. So from doing a general warm-up, we can increase blood flow, heart rate, muscle temperature, decrease muscle stiffness, and increase range of motion. From this study in 1983, this is just one part of the study, but basically after general warm-up, there was some small increases in range of motion and significant increases in range of motion of the ankle. So regardless of how much actual research is directly on this topic, it's pretty well established that most sports will require an increase in tissue temperature before moving on. So the next part of the warm-up is where we want to do some mobilization. So the goals of the mobilization part is to basically increase range of motion, and then to also take the joints through the range of motion that they're going to use in the exercise. So the methods we can use to do that are going to be stretching, self-massage, and tissue flossing. And how much time is going to be spent in the mobilization phase is going to be dependent on the sport. So, for example, in a sport like gymnastics, they're probably going to spend significant amounts of time doing particular mobilization techniques, whereas a boxer probably just needs to do a little bit of active stretching, and they should be good to go for their sport. So the first part, stretching. What sort of stretching should we use? So in this study here, they looked at different types of stretching on muscle and tendon properties. So basically they found that all the stretching increased range of motion a little bit. And what an interesting thing to note here is that from the ballistic stretching, there was increased tendon stiffness, whereas the other stretching methods decreased tendon stiffness. So when we were doing like maybe plyometric training or speed training, it could be a good idea to include ballistic training as opposed to static and PNF type stretching. So this study here looked at different stretching methods and the effect they had on performance. So as we can see, none of the stretching methods really increase performance to any significant degree. And in fact, the passive type methods, so passive stretching and PNF stretching, actually decrease performance quite significantly for the jumping, and somewhat non-significantly for the sprinting. And then the other active and ballistic stretching methods didn't really influence performance at all. So the take-home message from these studies is that we probably want to use active stretching, because that's going to allow us to get more range of motion and probably no performance benefit. But if we do sort of passive type stretching, then we might actually hinder performance. So we want to probably avoid that in the warm-up. The next part, another strategy we can use is self-massage. And so from this was a study, meta-analysis and systematic review, or just a systematic review. And basically they concluded that using myofascial release techniques, so foam rolling or roller massage, that can increase range of motion for the short term, and it doesn't really decrease performance. So that's another benefit. We can increase range of motion. There's not going to be a performance benefit, but we're not going to decrease performance by using these strategies. And the last method is going to be tissue flossing. So this was a recent study where they looked at tissue flossing and its effects on performance. So again, in this WBLT, which is weight bearing lunge test, which is a measure of range of motion at the ankle. There were significant increases in range of motion for up to 45 minutes, and there was also some increases in performance, some very slight increases in performance compared to the control group. So this is just one study, so there's potential benefit for performance from this type of mobilization technique. However, more research is probably required in order to actually clarify this. So again, we can increase range of motion, probably not going to increase performance a lot, but we can always get that increase of range of motion without a decrease in performance, which is a good thing. So to summarize the mobilization part, what our best methods we can use is going to be some sort of light, maybe self-massage, some tissue flossing, and then if you want to include some stretching, probably dynamic or active or ballistic stretching, something that's going to get us moving as opposed to the passive stretching methods. The next part of the warm-up will be activation. And so the purpose of the activation is to basically activate key muscle groups. We can use it as movement preparation, and we can also do some injury prevention exercises in the activation part of the warm-up. So some examples would be like maybe some glute activation if we're doing some exercise that is going to focus primarily on hip extension. So the glute activation might help us prepare for that exercise. Trunk muscle activation might help us prepare for bracing if we're doing some sort of maybe squatting or something that's going to require trunk bracing. So we might do some muscle activation to prepare for that. And we might do some rotator cuff and serratus anterior activation or exercises, which could be to prepare for overhead lifting, or it could be just to prepare for help prevent some injuries. So if we have a look at these studies, this one was on basically some hip muscle strengthening exercises, and they looked at basically, is that going to help prevent rehab the participants from an ACL injury? And disregarding the injury results, if we have a look at the movement sort of variables that they measured, so there was significantly decreased knee valgus when they were squatting, and when they were jumping as well in the training group. So that's an example of how it could be a movement preparation or an injury prevention exercise. And what they did in this was they did some side-lying hip adduction and some other glute type activation exercises. In this study, this was again probably more of a movement preparation study where they looked at the effect of putting an elastic band around the thighs while they were squatting, and they actually found slightly increased performance in the group with the elastic bands, which might be some sort of nervous system signal to help activate those hip muscles. And then last thing in the warm-up would be potentiation. So potentiation is going to be just basically exercises that are going to try and help us directly improve performance. So these are normally sport-specific drills that are just sort of naturally going to lead into the exercise or the session that we're about to do. So for example, it could be things like reactive passing and shooting drills for a soccer game, and then so that sort of prepares us directly to play a soccer match. There could be submaximal run-throughs before sprinting, so we're sort of slowly increasing how fast we're running, and then eventually we're going to do our maximal runs. And also lifting submaximal weights before our weightlifting attempts. So again, that's just slowly leading into that sport-specific exercise. The other thing we can do in the potentiation part of the warm-up is this sort of concept of post-activation potentiation, which is basically using a conditioning exercise to increase the performance of the next exercise that we're going to do. So the theory behind this is that it's basically going to excite, in quotes, the nervous system, and what it's doing is basically trying to fire the motor units and then for the next exercise we use, we have maximal motor unit recruitment. And it allows an athlete to generally perform super maximally for an acute time period. So from this systematic review and meta-analysis from 2017, this was on post-activation potentiation exercises on sprint performance, and so they showed that post-activation potentiation significantly reduced sprint time in comparison to the control conditions. So that's evidence to suggest that that post-activation potentiation is going to be beneficial, but this is a separate topic in itself. It can be used for submaximal weightlifting. It can be used for jumping performance. It's generally used for more explosive type performances. And finally, here are just some examples of a full warm-up for some sports. So for a sprinting session or a sprinting race or something like that, we might do, for the tissue temperature part, just some light jogging for 3 to 5 minutes to get warm. So then some mobilization, we might do light foam rolling and then probably a dynamic type warm-up, and we're probably going to target more the hips, ankles, and shoulders, which are going to be the main prime movers in when you're sprinting. Then we might do some specific activation drills, so maybe some glute and core activation, and then probably some running technique drills prior to actually sprinting to get some of those movement patterns firing. And then for the potentiation, we're probably just going to do some submaximal run-throughs, increasing intensity until we get to our heavier sets, and our faster sets. And then we could potentially use a really heavy sled pull before our fastest reps as a post-activation potentiation exercise. Another example for weightlifting, same thing, we might do some light cycling for 3 to 5 minutes for tissue temperature. Then we might mobilize. We're probably going to do, a weightlifter's probably going to do more mobilization than a sprinter, so they might do light foam rolling. They might do tissue flossing of the ankle in particular, because that's probably going to be important for them to get into a nice deep squat. And then they might do a dynamic warm-up targeting probably the thoracic spine, hips, ankles, and shoulders, which are the main potential performance limiting joints. Moving on to the activation part of the warm-up, they might do some core activation drills to prepare for bracing. They might do some overhead movement preparation, maybe some scapular sort of activation type exercises in order to prepare them to get into that nice full overhead range. And then for the potentiation, they're probably just going to do a barbell warm-up and then start working submaximally leading up to their maximal working weights. That's it for this presentation. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you got something out of it. If you like those research infographics, check movement and performance out on Facebook and Instagram. And for more content, subscribe on YouTube. Thanks for watching.